It says it's connecting.
Yes, there are 10 attendees now.
Yep,
Perfect.
Hello, everyone. Welcome. You're all just sort of slowly trickling into the webinar. We'll get started just after 5:30. Hello, everyone. Welcome to the Energy Institute live webinar. We'll get started in just a few minutes still. People are still joining, and so we'll get started just after 5:30. Okay, I think we'll get started soon. So it's just after 5:30. Welcome. Thank you so much for joining today's webinar. This is the Energy Institute Young Professionals Network, and this is our first virtual live event on Zoom. So we're really excited for everyone to join us today. Today's topic is technology of carbon capture and storage technology. Every month, typically us at the Energy Institute run a event, a panel, a webinar on a different topic on the energy transition or energy industry. So we've done events on energy storage in the past. We do networking events. Today's event is on carbon capture and storage technology, like I said, and thank you so much for joining today. We've got a great selection of speakers this afternoon. We've got Chris again from the CCSA, Emra Dursut from Element Energy, Soren Tan from Shell, and Rebecca Heaton from Drax Power. And first, some housekeeping for the event. This is our first Zoom event. We have well over possibly 100 attendees signed up, which is fantastic. We expect everything to run as smoothly as possible, but this is our first Zoom event. If there are some hiccups, please just bear with us as we catch up. All the attendees today are muted, but if you have any questions, you can ask them in the Q&A section of your Zoom client. So feel free throughout the presentation to open up the Q&A section, ask a question. Our speakers will be able to see your questions and we'll pick them out. If any of the questions are sort of the same, we'll try and aggregate them into a question, and we'll try and answer as many as we can. We have an hour today, and so I think we can get started with Chris. Chris, can I hand it over to you, and thank you very much.
Thank you. Thank you very much. And yes, so I'm going to give a quick introduction to CCS. Very briefly touch on the UK. I know that we will hear a bit more about UK projects from later presentations, and just a quick overview of where we are at globally. So next slide, please. So the CCSA are the Trade Association for Carbon Capture and Storage, and our goal is to develop policy in the UK and internationally to ensure the rollout of commercial scale CCS. We were established 2006, and we represent over 40 industrial partners from several sectors, including finance, industry, the oil and gas majors, and insurance, and a wide variety of different companies. We also run the Secretariat services for the Zero Emissions Platform, which is the EU. Run the Secretariat for the CCS set plan, which looks to bring together nations to progress CCS in Europe. So next slide, please. So what is CCS? It's a bit of a common term now. Good news for me, and it is carbon capture and storage, and the goal is to capture the carbon from industrial emissions, from power plants, from hydrogen production from natural gas, and even potentially capture from biomass-based activities, and I think we'll hear a bit more about the negative emissions story from later speakers. So once the carbon's captured, it's transported via pipeline or ship, and then it's pumped underground in geological formations, be that depleted oil and gas fields or larger, what we call saline aquifer formations. So these are typically sort of sandstones or carbonate rocks like limestones, which are capped. And in the same process by which oil and gas is trapped underground for millions of years for oil and gas reservoirs, the same principles apply for CO2 storage. There's also the U in CCUS, which is usage or utilization, depending on how it's written, and that is to use CO2 in products, in mineralization or synthetic fuels, or in a process called enhanced oil recovery, which I'll touch on a bit later on. Next slide, please. So without going into detail around the UK clusters, I think this slide here shows the UK offshore waters. I think will mainly draw your attention to those circles. Now they are all of the mapped potential UK storage sites. Now the circle size depends on the storage size, and this resource is available online on a website called CO2 Stored, and it shows that the UK is very, very well placed, at least in the storage side. It has a vast capacity, and thankfully for the UK, a lot of our industrial emissions are actually on the coast. So a few of them are highlighted here. Next slide, please. And as I said, these will be touched on in a bit more detail, but some of the largest industrial clusters of emitters are actually coastal or sort of estuary bound, and that lends itself well to being able to reach out to these vast storage resources which we have in the UK. The only exception to that being South Wales, which is looking into the shipping part of transport more so than the pipeline. But we'll move on to the next slide, please. So as I mentioned earlier, the U in CCUS is for utilization, and I also mentioned enhanced oil recovery. So here's a map of all of the CCS facilities in operation or under construction in the world. And you can see that North America dominates, and that's because the enhanced oil recovery drives their projects in America. They have an incentive to run that as an economic model, and they're also upgrading that now with a system called the 45Q, which looks to incentivize pure CO2 storage as well as EOR. So that economic model is what's driving storage in America. In Europe, we've had storage in Norway in a place called the Sleipner field, 1 million tons per year since 1996. So it's a proven technology, and it does work. And there are plenty of exciting European projects which are on similar timelines to the UK projects, if not a year or two, perhaps ahead. So next slide, please. So this is just a bit of a breakdown of CCS in terms of the sectors that it covers and the projects which are under development. And it's quite a nice diagram. I quite like it. It shows that different sectors obviously have different progressions, and natural gas processing and power generation are, for the time being, the projects which are in operation, and then there are several in sort of advanced development. EOR isn't included in this. This is just purely as a sort of a capture process from global projects. Now, I'm just going to stop there, and I think there's obviously lots of questions with CCS. It covers lots of sectors, so I'm happy to answer any of those. If you email me or drop a message in the chat, and if the questions aren't answered in the later sessions, then I'll be happy to answer any questions.
I think I'm next. Thanks, Chris. Thank you very much for the introduction. Hope you can see me and hear me okay. Yeah, let me know if you can't. Good afternoon, everyone. Thank you very much for joining this webinar. Hopefully it's going to be interesting. I'll talk about what might the UK first CCS projects look like, and before that, maybe I can introduce myself and the company. If you can go to the next slide, please. So we're a low carbon energy consultancy, one of the first consultancies focusing on low carbon energy in the UK, potentially in Europe and globally as well. As a company, we cover the full energy space. So I'm leading our CCS industrial decarbonisation team, but we do have other teams on energy networks, smart energy systems, hydrogen, low carbon transport and built environment. We have more than 60 consultants within the organization, you know, full of young professionals and quite brilliant people like Antonia, who is on the line today. And then, yeah, we all together, we help private sector and public sector clients to help them tackle climate change altogether. Moving on to the next slide. So before I talk about the potential next CCS projects in the UK, I would like to mention a bit of history in the UK. So what worked and what didn't work in the UK before in the previous CCS projects. So as you may already know, we've been working on CCS in the UK. We've been trying this for a long time now, more than 10 years. And historically, let's say in 2005 to 2015, in that decade, the narrative was mostly around power CCS, and initially actually more around clean coal and cleaning or decarbonizing coal power plants in the UK. So we spent about a bit of time on that at first, and then we moved on so we had two commercialization programs and CCS competitions in the UK. The first one was in 2017, and the second one was, I think, commissioned in 2012, which was also predominantly was about power CCS, because the understanding was that the power CCS projects would go first. And actually the second difficulty I think we had was that we discussed the role of CCS against renewables. So whether we need renewables or whether we should instead invest in power CCS projects in the UK. I'm not saying we didn't have the right projects. I think we had pretty good projects in the UK as project concepts. I think the narrative at that time period was a bit different compared to today. And if you can go to the next slide, that was one of the key reasons why we had two cancellations in the UK, amongst with some other reasons in terms of kind of cancellation of projects due to the funding reasons. But we did both competition projects in the UK from 2007 to 2011, and then 2012 to 15, if I remember the dates correctly, both cancelled, unfortunately, and that led to quite significant amount of time that we lost in the UK. So since 2015, the last cancellation, we've been reassessing the role of CCS. So why do we need CCS in the UK? Do we really need, baseload power CCS projects against renewables, or do we have a different role for CCS in the UK? And I think now we're working on a wide range of things that CCS can do, which are all very exciting. So if you can go to the next slide, that tries to show and illustrate, this is based on one of our recent publications, the things that you can do with CCS, not just in the UK, but also globally. If you look at the left-hand side, CCS is an enabling technology. So CCS is not only about power CCS, it's about decarbonizing pretty much everything, direct or indirectly. Looking at the left-hand side of the diagram with CCS, yes, we can decarbonize power, but maybe not coal-fired power plants in the UK, but maybe flexible gas generation, power generation in the UK, supporting the renewable deployment in the UK. So there's a specific role in the power generation. But we can also do exciting things with CCS. Combined with biomass, we can deliver negative emissions, which are vital to get to net zero, again, in the UK, but also globally. And I think we're going to hear a bit more about the negative emissions potential and BECCS concept in the UK from Drax later today. Industry is an interesting one. So we have a lot of process emissions, not just fuel related or heat related, just process due to the process of industries. So certain industries like iron and steel and chemicals and so on. We have a lot of emissions that we can't simply tackle without CCS. So it will play an important role to get to deep decarbonization of energy intensive industries, again in the UK, but also globally. And we also with CCS, you can do another interesting thing, and you can potentially produce large scale, low carbon hydrogen, along with green hydrogen concept, which is from electrolyzers and with renewable energy. So blue hydrogen can be produced at scale, which can then meet the demand in almost all of the sectors where we use natural gas today. So you can replace natural gas in industry, replace natural gas in heat, but in power generation directly, you can use hydrogen. And there is some work on hydrogen gas turbines. Also in transport, we can use hydrogen. As a company, we've been working on this concept for a long time on hydrogen buses, trucks, etc. So hydrogen will play an important role there as well. So as you can see, CCS is not anymore a single, clean coal, let's say, technology. We're talking about quite a number of different things, which are all vital to get to net zero in the UK. So if you can move on to the next slide, please. So that's why in the current project concepts, so I'm listing just 4 of them, potential first movers in the UK, we are not only seeing, just point-to-point, full chain power CCS projects anymore. We are seeing quite a number of different concepts. So most of the cluster projects and CCS projects now include, if you look at the Northwest, for example, on the kind of top left-hand side, we're talking about CCS as well as hydrogen production. Again, on the right-hand side, the Humber cluster will hear more about this. We're talking about BECCS as well as hydrogen production and direct application of CCS in addition to that. And in T side, we have industrial cluster along with a clean gas power generation. So as you can see nowadays, the CCS concept and the CCS projects are a bit more interesting, I must say. So we have a lot of different players coming together, trying to demonstrate the wide range of things the CCS can do in our transition to net zero. And then finally, in the bottom left, you can see the Scotland, the Acorn project, which we hope will enable quite exciting things in Scotland, both in terms of CCS in power and industry, but also as in hydrogen production and potentially negative emissions as well. So that's I think what we're expecting in the UK, and potentially these 4 projects, at least one of them, potentially more, are expected to be the kind of first movers in the UK. And we also have South Wales and other interesting CCS concepts as well, which hopefully will be deployed in the next 10 years or so. But probably they may be a bit as a kind of follow-on project to those 4 projects as are shown on this slide. So finally, I'm going to talk about some of the kind of policy priorities. So can we go to the next slide, please? So, I already mentioned the kind of key role CCS, hydrogen, and BECCS will play in the net zero transition. This slide purely focuses on kind of industrial clusters. So industrial clusters are quite important in the UK, as Chris mentioned. So we have a couple of clusters, significant emission sources from those clusters, and there is significant funding available in the UK, hundreds of millions of pounds and potentially more, up to billion plus, to help decarbonize those clusters in the next year or 2. And within that decarbonization agenda, we think fuel switching to hydrogen, carbon capture and storage, negative emissions, and etc. will play an important role. But if you can go to the next slide, we still have quite a few policy decisions and uncertainties. So the government is making some good progress. So they published a consultation on likely business models and market mechanisms for a wide range of CCS applications. transport and storage, power, CCS, industrial carbon capture, hydrogen production, negative emissions, and so on. So we hope that the government will bring some clarity around what type of models and policies could work. But I guess this kind of shows some of the complexity here, that there are some questions that still need to be answered. For example, from the hydrogen side, so what's the hydrogen production business model that still needs to be answered and implemented? So how are we going to incentivize blue hydrogen as well as green hydrogen? What's the right business model? Is it regulated? Is it something else? Is it certificate scheme? Is it a tax-based scheme? So there are so many options that are still available. Again, for hydrogen, we're also interested in understanding how can we switch existing demand into hydrogen. So that may require totally different and separate business models to convince the industrial players or heat system to switch to hydrogen. On CCS side, as I said, transport and storage business models is likely to be either regulated asset-based or public ownership. So I don't have time to get into details today, but please get in touch with me if you want to discuss this further. But yeah, there are some quite different options available for CCS, transport and storage, but also for capture sites that still needs to be answered. And again, for negative emissions, hopefully we'll hear a bit more from Drex today. Still, we need to clarify what the right business model is for negative emissions. So I think, as I said, I think we have a clear idea now in terms of what the first project should look like and what CCS should do in the UK as a clear role for CCS. But in terms of policy, there's still a significant amount of work that we need to do over the next year or two to enable those projects. I think I'm going to leave it there. But if you have any questions, obviously you can submit via Q&A, but also you can get in touch with me after this conference webinar if you want to discuss these further. Thank you very much.
Perfect, thanks, Emre. We've got a few questions come in on the Q&A, so you should be able to see those, but I'll pick one of those out. So there's a question on which CCS application, so industry, power, direct air capture, hydrogen, etc., is the most important in the UK, and how does that vary regionally around the world?
Okay, sorry, I was on mute. It's a good question. So I think, as I mentioned, hopefully that diagram illustrated. So most of these things cannot be easily replaced by other technologies. So, negative emissions, we've been helping the Committee on Climate Change and the UK government for the last couple of years in terms of this net zero advice and net zero target in the UK, which is legislated now. So it is almost impossible to get the net zero in the next couple of decades without some negative emissions. So it's important. So I can't tell what exactly will happen, but we definitely need some negative emissions. And it's clear that, BECCS and direct air capture will play an important role in the UK. And we've been working with IEA on this. And we think, again, negative emissions and direct air capture will be an important part of the kind of global CCS space as well. But I can't say, industrial CCS is not needed because, as I said, especially for process emissions from cement and iron and steel and chemicals, you can't simply switch fossil fuel into another low carbon fuel. You can't tackle the process emissions, and they're quite significant. So either we shut down all these sites and lose, thousands of jobs in the UK, or we will find a way to decarbonize them. And currently, CCS is one of the kind of most important ways to get that in industry. But again, in power, we've done some studies around the role of CCS in power, and it's not easy to just say, yes, we have renewables in the system. Renewables are extremely important, but that also brings some requirement regarding flexibility in the system. And it looks like, natural gas with CCS and also hydrogen, potentially gas turbines, could play an interesting role in the UK to support renewables. And hydrogen, again, I'm sure you've read so many reports, is an important aspect of it. And with green hydrogen, we think blue hydrogen will play an important role. I've seen another question about why do we need blue hydrogen? It's basically to bring scale in the short term because it's already quite low carbon and you can actually produce significant amount of blue hydrogen. Then you can go ahead and decarbonize major users like industry and heat, which may not be possible in the short term with green hydrogen if you want to decarbonize the whole industrial cluster, for example, although we are involved in green hydrogen initiatives in the UK in industry as well. So we think green and blue should go in parallel in the UK, but also globally where it makes sense. Hope it answered two questions in a row, but happy to answer further now or maybe in the Q&A session.
Perfect. I saw a question come up there that might be relevant to Chris as well. There's a question that says, is there a CCS technology available for a large-scale CO2 capture at the moment. So, Chris, I don't know if you want to elaborate on that from your perspective.
Difficult to understand what a large-scale CO2 capture is. I think the CCS technologies at the moment are obviously where the point sources are emitted. Now, there are various different ways you can capture carbon, and that's quite an exciting, if not very chemically driven conversation, which can get quite technical very quickly. But it's a very active area of innovation, and there is potentially lots to learn there. In terms of large-scale CO2 capture, I guess direct air capture is something potentially to look forward to in the future, but that comes with its own caveats in terms of having a completely renewable or decarbonised energy system to run. But I guess that's a conversation for a bit further down the line, perhaps in a decade or so. We'll be in a better position to understand how direct air capture may fit, particularly in sort of a 100% renewable grid and how that is deployed. But it's an exciting area to sort of follow and to think of the next 10, 20 years and the ramifications of an energy system which is balancing direct air capture and green hydrogen production as well.
Brilliant, thank you. I think we'll take one more question for now, and the others we can save potentially until the end in the interest of time. So there's quite an interesting question coming around the timescales for you, Emrah. So there's a question saying it seems that obviously CCS is a great method to transition to other sources of energy, maybe in the medium to long term, but will it be relevant when the transition is complete, and will it only be applicable to industrial clusters?
I think it's a good question. So as I said, CO2 emissions are cumulative. So even if in the longer term we'll get to a different point in the future where maybe in 100 years time you won't need CCS at all, for example, still every single amount of CO2 we emit today stays in the atmosphere. So we can't really delay and wait until something else happens in 20, 30, 40 years time. So I guess in terms of kind of transition to other low carbon fuels and industry, for example, there's a future where maybe you won't use cement and steel anymore in 50 years time or something if you have alternatives to those or different methods of production of those materials somehow, which may not require CCS. But as I said, we can't really wait until that happens automatically and magically, because we still have significant amount of emissions from those industrial emitters in the UK, but also in Asia, in other regions. It's one of the major emitters globally, and it's unlikely that all these countries will shut down those sites and switch to something else on their own. So it will be important to find ways to decarbonize those industrial sources in the meantime. So I guess it's true that CCS is a transition technology, but I guess we're not talking about a 10-year transition here. It's a bit quite long-term transition, so we can't really wait and delay this further.
Brilliant, thanks very much, Emrah. I think we'll move on to the next presentation now, which is Suan from Shell.
Thanks, Antonia. Thanks. Hi, everyone. I'm sorry I can't be there on video or Zoom, but Shell doesn't support us using the Zoom calls for now. So I will just be a voice coming down the line to all of you. So good afternoon, everyone. I hope you're all staying safe and well in these challenging times. I do want to thank the Energy Institute Young Persons Network, particularly Antonia, Joe and Nathan for organizing this webinar. I think it's great that you guys are really embracing the challenge of working from home and trying to keep sharing information digitally. Next slide, please. Now, I know you won't be able to read all of this in detail, but before I go any further, I do have to highlight the disclaimer statement that I'm obliged to share. Next slide, please. Before talking about sort of the role of the oil and gas industry and what we're doing for CCS, I did want to share a little bit about the climate challenge more broadly, and also specifically Shell's updated climate ambition, which we announced last month, and the role that we see CCS playing, both in that broader energy transition, but also for Shell in how we achieve our ambition. So I think it's clear that for society to achieve a 1.5 degrees Celsius future, the world is likely to need to stop adding to the stock of greenhouse gases in the atmosphere. And this is what most people will refer to as the net zero emissions by around 2060. but those who can move faster must move faster. And in particular, advanced parts of the world, like the UK, for example, or EU more broadly, we're likely to need to reach that point by 2050. Charles also recognizes that it stands within a section of society that needs to move faster. And that's why we announced a new ambition to be a net zero emissions energy business by 2050 or sooner, if possible. And we will work towards this ambition in 3 ways. Firstly, we have a new ambition to achieve net zero operational emissions, scope 1 and 2 by 2050 or sooner. And so those are all the emissions associated with manufacturing and bringing Shell's energy and non-energy products to the market. Second, we've significantly raised what we call our net carbon footprint ambition. So these are the footprint of the energy products that we sell to be in line with society that wants to achieve a 1.5 degrees Celsius future. And thirdly, as a business that clearly supplies energy, we want to work with sectors which use energy, many of which you've already heard referred to today, to help identify and enable decarbonisation pathways for them to follow towards a net zero emissions future. And for those customers who still have emissions as they near 2050, we will work with them even more intensely to find a way to mitigate those emissions. Now, all three elements of those ambition that I referred to will require CCS. So that's just for Shell specifically as one company that is an energy supplier. But it's also clear that CCS is essential to reaching the Paris climate goals more broadly. And it's also critical because it does play a role in supporting industry growth and jobs. If I could quote the International Panel on Climate Change, they've clearly stated that the early stage sector CCS is essential to achieving stringent temperature targets. And you'll see in any of the IPCC potential scenarios, which is basically what the scientists do to model out how do we get to a 1.5 degree global world, CCS is included in all of those potential scenarios. It really is a vital lever to pull to help the world to reach net zero emissions. It's not easy, and it is going to require this extensive collaboration between governments, the role of shareholders and investors, the role of NGOs, heavy industry, us in the oil and gas industry, to really help unlock financing capacity, accelerate the technology development which is required, and most importantly, and you saw a little bit of that in Emra's presentation, encourage the public support for an industry to be ready to store CO2 at scale by 2030. Next slide, please. I'm not going to go into great detail of this slide because Emra has clearly already highlighted the importance of CCS for the heavy industries such as cement and steel. I think the only point I really want to note is, there are several decarbonization options for the heavy industry, but it is really critical for some of these that CCS really has that key role to play because for some of these options, they're just not viable. For example, electrification of heat is not a solution available to all industries due to the quality, which is basically the temperature of heat required in, for example, to make iron and steel, you need temperatures at around 1,200, degrees Celsius. So it's just not currently available. Next slide, please. I just now have two slides. One to really highlight this first one here about what sort of Shell is doing in our involvement in the development and deployment of CCS in projects and what we're doing to invest in the next wave of CCS technologies. So I'll start from the left and work my way across. The first three are projects that we actually have in operation already. The first one is Quest, which is a project that we have in partnership with the Canadian government and our joint venture partners in Alberta, Canada, and that captures and stores CO2 from the Scotford upgrader. The upgrader turns bitumen into synthetic crude oil using hydrogen. Quest has captured and safely stored more than 1 million tons of CO2 per year since 2015, so it's an important flagship project for us. The next one along to the slide at the bottom is the Technology Centre Mongstad, which is one that Shell works together with the Norwegian government, Equinor and Total, where we're undertaking further research and development into CCS technologies to help reduce its cost. The next one is Gorgon, which is in Australia. And this one, Shell is involved in the CO2 injection project, which will be the world's largest CCS operation when completed. The Gorgon CCS project, which is operated by Chevron, will separate and re-inject between 3.4 million and 4 million tons of CO2 into the reservoir each year. And over the life of the project, it is expected that around 100 million tons of CO2 will be captured and stored. And Gorgon got moved into operation in August of last year. The next 3 are projects that we have under planning at the moment. So the first one is Pernis CCS project, which is an opportunity for Shell to route some of the CO2 that we'll capture from our Pernis refinery, which is in the Netherlands. And then we will link that to the Porthos project in the port of Rotterdam that is aiming to transport and store CO2 from the Rotterdam Harbour industrial cluster. Net Zero Teesside, which you saw on the LNM slide, so Shell, along with BP, Eni, Equinor, Total, we're looking to develop the UK's first gas power project with CCS, and I think it's a really important anchor project, and the importance of anchor projects generally in these hubs to really support the industrial decarbonisation that's needed in the UK Teessides region. The final one in the project under planning is the Northern Lights project, which is a CO2 transport and storage partnership between Shell, Equinor, and Total. And here the plan is to progress the development of a carbon transport and storage system on the Norwegian continental shelf. And then finally, the one on the right is a technology example. So this is the use of CCS technology that we, part of one of our businesses called Shell CanSolve, developed, and it's currently being used at the power station Boundary Dam in Saskatchewan in Canada. It is Sex Power's largest coal-fired power station and has a significant source of power for the region. And so the technology is used to capture both sulfur dioxide and CO2 from the power station. Next slide, please. So I just also want to now talk a little bit and share a bit on the broader work that the oil and gas industry is doing to try and move the advance and the deployment of CCS more broadly around the world. And so this is the work of the Oil and Gas Climate Initiative, which is a consortium of 12 oil and gas companies, including Shell, and working to accelerate the transition to a low carbon future. So in September of last year, the OGCI launched its Kickstarter initiative, which is really designed to facilitate large-scale commercial investment in CCUS by enabling multiple low-carbon industrial hubs. So these hubs, the plan for them is to capture CO2 from several industrial sources within the region, one particular region, and then bring economies of scale by sharing transport and storage infrastructure. We will also look for opportunities to use some of the carbon dioxide in products, which Chris kind of referred to earlier. The Kickstarter initiative aims to work with governments and across industry to facilitate the necessary market conditions for investment in hubs and projects by our member companies, so between the 12 of us, by governments, by the OGCI Climate Investments, which is the OGCI's $1 billion plus investment fund, and any other independent investors. We want to play our part in the emergence of a commercially viable, safe, and environmentally responsible CCUS industry that can contribute at the scale we know is required to help meet the aims of the Paris Agreement while supporting economic growth. So what we're trying to do first now is we are focusing firstly on 5 emerging hubs and trying to work to bring those into operation this year. And then we're working also looking down into the future towards building a pipeline of potential future hubs. So if I quickly just highlight the 5 hubs that you can see on that map, or the atlas, the globe. So the first one is Teesside, UK, which I've already talked about and also Emma referred to. I think what's really nice about the Net Zero Teesside project is it has garnered a high level of local support. So I really think it is a good opportunity to be that kind of anchor project to kickstart that hub in that region. Secondly, also I've already talked about the Northern Lights project in Norway. And again, our focus here from the OGCI and member company participation is how can we think of building that common transport and storage solution? How do we build that out so that the various capture sources, which will be independent, some of which are onshore in Norway, have somewhere to actually, get their CO2 to be stored in. The third one is Rotterdam, the Netherlands. Again, this is the one I mentioned earlier. In terms of what we're doing with the Pernis refinery, of Shell's refinery in the Netherlands, but we're also working with other potential emitters in the local Rotterdam region. There's refineries, the hydrogen production, the CO2 imports from Northern Europe, and then working then with the government, the Netherlands government, to find a way to store it offshore, and we looks like the potential to store is about 10 million tons by 2030, which will be a good investment for the Netherlands. The fourth one is Xinjiang in China. So the Xinjiang hub is located in northwest China. There are several industries in that local area. So they're looking at ways to capture CO2, most likely starting with from the refining sector, and then sort of grow that out over time. So it's quite in early stages at the moment, but the Chinese government is interested in this project, and there is support for it. And then finally, the fifth one is the Gulf of Mexico in the USA. The US Gulf Coast, for those of you who know it, really does have several advantages for CCUS hub development. There's great storage and injection opportunities. That geology is really well researched and known. There's a lot of good industrial expertise, involved. There's transport pipelines existing, and most importantly, and Emra referred to this, there's really strong state level and federal policies, which is so critical at the moment to really get CCUS at scale. So in conclusion, CCS is really not a nice to have, it's a must. Shell, as one company, we participate constructively in the future of the energy business, and we want to continue investing in CCS. And we also have a lot of good technical expertise in-house to support that progress. But it's also, I think, the challenge that we have in front of us. CCS is not something that one company or even one industry, one sector can resolve. It is important that we continue to work with other oil and gas companies, both through the OGCI and other industrial initiatives, but also with government on the policies that we know are required to support us at the start. With shareholders, our investors, we need the civil society and NGO representatives supporting us, and also the other heavy industries, which Emma talked about, to really ramp up the deployment to the levels needed to meet the Paris goals. So thanks again for the opportunity to speak today. I hope you're all staying safe and well, and enjoy the long weekend.
Thanks very much, Sue Ann. We've had a few questions come in on that, so it's really nice to hear really just about the scale of Shell's involvement already in CCS and the number of projects that you're trying to push forward. And you already mentioned obviously government support and policy, but there have been a few questions coming in around whether incentives are needed now and in the future, and what those incentives should be. So for example, we've got one saying, what is the best policy framework to create an economic incentive to store CO2 underground, and what are the barriers to private sector investment, and why does the private sector need government support in this?
Yeah, I mean, so that's quite a multi-pronged question. So I think what I would say is the actual policy support for CCS project will come in many shapes and sizes, right? And I think it's really critical that we look at it from a very country region specific. So for example, in the US, this is going to sound a bit technical, but there's basically it's a tax credit that the federal government has put in place to support the storage of CO2. And that's made a real difference for potential projects in America. Now, the tax credit probably would not work in every other country for sort of obvious reasons. In Norway, in contrast, if I look at the Northern Lights project, a lot of what's driven that incentive is there's a very, very high carbon tax on petroleum activities, right? Now, that carbon tax on petroleum activities is not something that the US government, for example, would do, just the politics and the sort of countries just have those differences. So I would say, there's no kind of one easy answer. There is a mix between either some kind of tax credit or a high price on carbon, or sometimes also we have things like a low carbon fuel standards, which incentivize, acts as another kind of financial incentive. But I think it's really clear that at this point in time of where the CCS projects are and the stage of its deployment, you can't do it without some kind of enabling policy. I think that's really required. Yeah, I just don't see how it can happen at this point in time without the government support.
Mm-hmm. Perfect, that's clear. And we've also got a question around Shell's net zero ambition. So you talked briefly around this 2050 ambition. There's two parts to this. So one is what proportion of the emissions reduction there relies on CCS explicitly, and then the other is what are Shell's assumptions around the change in oil demand globally? Will we still be using almost as much oil as today, but applying CCS to it, or do you think there'll be a a huge drop in oil consumption, and where do you think that might end up in 2050?
So definitely that second question is not one that I would venture to give a very specific answer to, but let me do my best. So the first thing around the role of CCS. So we've been very clear in our communication around our climate ambition that we see a definite role for sinks to get to net zero. And that's not just for Shell. You know, I think just for the world, there is no scenario that the IPCC has done that goes up to 2050 where you don't have some kind of sinks for the energy sector. And when I say energy sector, I mean the whole energy sector, not just the oil and gas industry, can get to net zero. So there has to be a role for sinks. We will be releasing further information about our strategy and how this gets implemented in the second half of this year. But we know it's clear, and we've made it already explicitly clear, that to get to the future that we know is required and the part that Shell wants to play in that future, we need to fundamentally change. So that is clear. Now we would, we're spending some time looking at that internally, and we'll come up with more information in the second half of this year. The other thing, though, is it's also clear that there will be some kind of fossil fuels in the world in 2050. Now, the IEA, many others have already projected, there's heaps of, people trying to guess what that quantity looks like. But there will be, especially right now, given the technologies that are available, based on what we can see, some role for fossil fuels in the 2050s. And that's just because for some industries, like some of the examples they've given you, you can't get those industries going without the particular chemistry that fossil fuels can provide. But what that actual percentage is, I would rather you refer to the IEA rather than Shell give its own forecast.
Sure. I mean, I guess, like you say, there's a huge amount of uncertainty at the moment. So I appreciate you can't make an estimate that far out. Brilliant. Well, I think we'll move on now, as it's 6:15. So I'll hand over to our last speaker, who is Rebecca from Drax, to tell us a bit more about negative emissions and bioenergy.
Hello. Well, again, thank you very much for inviting me today to give a talk. I'm really going to be carrying on the same sort of themes which the other speakers have said, but talking a little bit more about biomass energy with carbon capture and storage. But I'd like to start, first of all, if we can have the first slide, with a little bit about Drax. So a lot of you may know us as a northern power station burning coal, but actually as a company, we're now much more than that, and we've undergone a considerable transformation. And really what we want to do around biomass energy and carbon capture and storage is part of that. So we've transformed from being the UK's largest coal-fired power station to now being Europe's largest decarbonisation project. And we're the largest generator of renewable electricity in the UK and the third largest generator of power generally in the UK. So that's really due to, first of all, converting the power station in Drax from coal to biomass, and that's the picture there on the slide, but also through a period of acquisition. So we have a large pumped storage capacity, it's called Cruachan in Scotland. We also have hydro assets in Scotland, and we have gas assets as well. And our purpose is about supporting a low-cost transition to a zero-carbon power system in the UK. So we're really focusing on what can you do to support the intermittent renewables which we're going to need. Clearly, we're going to have predominantly in 2050 a solar and wind grid, but you're always going to need that little bit when the wind doesn't blow, the sun doesn't shine. You need something that's fast and dispatchable, and that's where we see a role for Drax in providing that. So if I move on to the next slide, the purpose of today is to really talk about biomass energy with carbon capture and storage. So several of the other speakers have talked about carbon capture and storage. The biomass energy bit is that instead of just capturing carbon from fossil fuels, you're capturing carbon from the burning of wood. So Drax is already the largest biomass generator in the world. We burn 7.5 million tonnes of wood, and that's the largest single site user of wood in the world. We started doing this in the early 2010s. In 2015, we converted our first unit, and now we have 4 out of the 6 units at Drax fully converted to run on biomass. So it's really important, if you consider biomass to be carbon neutral at the stack, that the forest is managed in the right way. I'm a forester. I work for Drax very much on ensuring those forests we take from are growing, and that we're following the latest science on feedstocks, which don't give you anything called carbon debt. And that's when people say, you know, you're burning this tree that took 50 years to grow. And it's really quite complex, some of the science around it, but we're following the latest science, and we're really confident that our feedstocks aren't causing that. And probably that sustainability conversation is a different talk, so I might move a little bit on to BECCS. So I hope you can see on this infographic here, we burn about 40% of what's called sawmill residue. So when a log goes into a sawmill, about half of it actually just comes out as sawdust, so we burn that. We burn forest residues from sustainably managed forests in our power station, and what we are doing and proposing to do at scale is capture the carbon from that. So that gives you what's called a negative emission. So if I go to the next slide, actually, I can see why this is important. Here we are. So if you look at the UK, so focusing very much on the UK only and on the work that the Committee on Climate Change did, to get to net zero by 2050, there are areas which we just cannot reduce down. So the thing on the chart here shows the residual positive emissions on the left. And these are predominantly from aviation and from agriculture. What can you do about those? The only way to still carry on having a lifestyle, you know, almost similar to what we have now, is to have negative emissions. So on the plus side, you've got this carbon coming out, you have to capture it and put it away. And that's really what Drax are doing with BECCS. So the Committee on Climate Change suggested that in the UK, we would need about 55 million tonnes of carbon capture of BECCS, of negative emissions, sorry, by 2050. And they have suggested that about 50 of that will probably come from BECCS, with the other 5 coming from wood in construction, so that's the long-term storage of carbon in wood in houses, and some coming from DACs, which is direct air capture rather than using a tree. So I say, you know, a tree has had millions of years to evolve to capture that carbon. They're very, very efficient at capturing carbon. And basically, we're just letting them capture carbon in fast-growing forests, harvesting it and putting that carbon under the sea. And it's almost really as though the energy is almost a side thing coming from that, because we desperately need to do this, this carbon capture. So if you look at the chart there, if we converted 4 of the units at Drax, we would have about 16 million tonnes out of the total needed by the UK in 2050 of about 55. So even with Drax, there's still quite a lot of wood, of action needed outside of Drax. So the next slide, please. So we've been piloting this, and we're now capturing a tonne a day. We're working with a Leeds University spin-out company called Capture. It's the first carbon capture project in the world from biomass feedstocks, and now we're looking at how we can really scale this up. So if we look at the next slide, we're part of something called the Zero Carbon Humber, and I'm aware other people have also talked about this. So we aren't going to be able to do this alone. I saw people talking about, do we need to have partnerships? Yes, absolutely. So Drax is a power station. We know lots about trees and we know lots about generating power. What we don't really know about is the transport and storage of CO2. So it's really important to work with the right partners, which we're doing with Equinor and with National Grid. But also we're part of the Zero Carbon Humber. So the Humber is the largest industrial emitting area in the UK. So it's not only us, we're a key anchor project, but what we want to do is work with others in that Humber area who are emitting CO2, so we can all share the same infrastructure. And there's also a hydrogen anchor project as well, which was mentioned by Emra earlier. We actually want to go quite fast on this, and we think by 2027 we can have 1 unit up and running. If you think what Drax did with biomass to coal, we had sort of 1 unit up and running in 2015, and by 2017 we had 3. So once we'd mastered that technology, it was quite quick then to actually really scale up. So if I move on to the next slide, I'm going quite fast, I know we haven't got a lot of time. Questions people have asked is how are we going to pay for this? It's such a good question, because we cannot live on eternal subsidies. That's really clear. At the moment, biomass energy is subsidised. So at the moment, we have something called a contract for difference, and that's a standard sort of power contract for renewables. But what we're doing is actually producing negative emissions. That's not power, that's a very different sort of product. And what we need to do is put a value on that. So it could be, you look at this sort of contract solution and you say, I think we should split out the power from the negative emissions, because those two are very separate things. And if we had a strong carbon price, there might be a way of perhaps selling it. The final option could be about perhaps putting it into the EU ETS. I think that would be terribly complicated. It's not what it's been designed to do, but it might work. We actually need something that's really investable. So we need to have some money to progress, to do this. Where do we get that funding from? That could be from bilaterals with emitting organisations who need to offset their carbon emissions. So these are the sorts of routes we're going down, and we're obviously working with government and with other industries to say, what can we do to all work together here to sort of fund this? So that's actually where I'm going to end. I've seen some sort of questions about sustainability. I think we're really confident on the full life cycle. So every ton of wood that we buy, we have to account for every single bit of emissions from the supply chain. So we have independent auditors who go out, they're third parties, they have nothing to do with us, and they report back, and we have to report that to the government saying there's been this much carbon emitted for the growing of the trees, because we use wood, and the transport of the trees on trains, the pelletization, we use wood pellets, which are very dense and dry, so they're much better to move around from a greenhouse gas emissions point of view, and then putting them on ships and bringing them here. So we're really confident of that bit. We obviously need to make sure what we're doing in the forest is right, and that's a lot of my job. And we've just announced a sustainability policy which follows the latest science, which has also been endorsed by NGOs and goes way beyond the government regulation on this and way beyond anything anyone else is doing. So I think you have to accept biomass is quite a young industry, and so there will be changes and evolutions as we learn more and more about it and just improve our sustainability. So I think that's it. Shall I look at these questions?
Sure. I just noticed there is a question coming in around sourcing back biomass from the UK versus overseas. So I guess the question is mainly, is it important that we ultimately source biomass from the UK in the future, or can we still be sourcing from abroad?
I'm really relaxed about sourcing from abroad. So why we source from the US predominantly is because they have some of the largest wood baskets in the world. So the fastest growing, most well-managed, largest areas of forestry in the world. And we're really confident that they are growing those forests in the right way. We put all our own checks in, but also it's a really well-regulated, mature forest industry. The UK imports 90% of its timber anyway. We are a nation that imports. I don't think we should be scared of it particularly. You know, we import oil and gas as well. You know, that's what we do as a country. I think with COVID, people are wanting to be a bit more self-sufficient. The Committee on Climate Change, which I should say I am a member of, I stepped back from the Bioenergy review, but that did talk about having some percentages of UK feedstocks. I absolutely wouldn't be averse to that. There have been issues in the past with it being seen as competition with the wood panel industry. So I think there's some issues to work through there, but I'm very relaxed about importing if we have the right sustainability regulation and that regulation is enforced. Also looking, if you don't mind jumping in, the role of BECCS and medium versus long-term baseload versus its peaking. That's a really interesting one and something we debate a lot. I think if you really wanted BECCS, you would probably run Drax as baseload. Rather than as biomass as peaking plant. I don't think we know enough, so it's very interesting when we develop our strategy that we've got several different options as to how this might be delivered.
Perfect. And the last part of that is, if you wanted to take a punt at what the unsubsidised levelised cost of BECCS might be.
I'm not going to do that, I'm afraid. We're doing lots of economics at the moment, is what I would say, yes, yeah. We're really looking at how we might be able to run this unsubsidised. So we announced the city before Christmas that we are looking at bringing the costs of feedstock down and being a lot more efficient in how we use it. So I think we absolutely see we need to bring that cost of that basic feedstock down to produce energy. But I think, again, the negative emissions is a different thing. It's a different product with a different market price.
Perfect. Thank you so much, Becky. I'm going to hand over now to Joe, who will say a few words just to wrap up.
Yeah.
Before I do, I'm going to hand over to Maria, who's just going to introduce Generation 2050, a EI initiative for this year.
Yeah, Thank you very much. And yeah, thank you to all our speakers. So yeah, just wanted to very quickly highlight this project that the Energy Institute is undertaking called Generation 2050. So as you can see, obviously climate change is an emergency, and it's an emergency that concerns us all. But the people that will be the most affected by it in 2050 will be the people that are, well, training or going to become the energy leaders of 2050. And how do we get their voices carried out to current energy leaders who will have the most impact on what our world will look like in 2050? So this project is all about that, and really having young professionals in energy, their voices heard by the people that matter most right now, but also carrying them through to the position that they will be in 2050 when they are in charge. So this project is very much ongoing. So this is basically just asking you to stay tuned for that project. So at the moment, what's being worked on is a kickoff survey that's going to go out to YPN members, but I think the Energy Institute is just looking to share that as far and wide as possible. Just gathering some input on young people's opinions on our energy scope at the moment. And then there will be other opportunities to join into the project, such as an invitation to the Energy Institute's podcast called Energy in Conversation. We're trying to link it as well to COP26. Obviously, that's kind of pending because of the COVID situation. And the aim of it is to create a report with lots of data and lots of opinions of young people, and get that report out to industry, to government, and to the people that are in charge of the energy industry at the moment, and to really have those voices heard. So stay tuned for the social media campaign that will kick off soon. And yeah, it's bound to be a really interesting project. So that's it from me. I'll hand over to Joe now.
Thanks, Maria. Thanks very much. Just before I let you all get back to your evenings, I just wanted to spend the final minute having a bit of a plug for what's coming up with regard to the EI YPN. So naturally, with regard to the COVID-19 situation that we find us all in, we have had to rethink our offering here at the Energy Institute's YPN. So for those of you who had signed up to it, you will have seen that we had to postpone our YPN Connect scheduled back in March. We've also had to cancel our second run of the offshore field trip, both unfortunate events, but very understandable given the circumstances. We are hoping to be able to run both of those events just as soon as we can, depending on what the new normal looks like and when that evolves. In the meantime, we are moving virtual, so thanks very much for joining us on our very first webinar. We're hoping that this format works for you. Our second run of this will be in June, or perhaps towards the end of this month, where we'll be talking about financing energy, discussing topics such as how does the energy sector raise finance, and how is the wider sector impacted by the recent oil price volatility. Following that, we will actually be coming up with our AGM, which we have in July each year. So just a bit of a plug for this. If you are thinking about getting involved with the YPN, this is your opportunity to sign up to the committee. We'll be re-electing committee members during this AGM, so stay posted for how to get involved on that. The committee members set the agenda for the next 12 months, and we help facilitate networking amongst energy young professionals, which will be a bit of a challenge, I think, for the next 12 months, but we like a challenge, so if you do too, please get involved. Stay up to date via our social media feeds. The best, most reliable are via our LinkedIn and the emailing list, so please do sign up to stay in touch. And we look forward to continuing the discussion on our LinkedIn discussion board. So not taking up any more time, I'd like to have a final thank you to our speakers this evening, Chris, Sue-Ern, Emma and Rebecca. Thanks to Antonia and Nathan for their hard work in organising tonight, and thanks to all of you for joining. We hope to see you next time, and in the meantime, please stay safe.